This morning's gospel is read from the 13th chapter of the gospel according to St. Matthew. That same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat beside the sea. Such great crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat there, while the whole crowd stood on the beach. And he told them many things in parables, saying, "Listen, a sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seeds fell on the path, and the birds came and ate them. Other seeds fell on rocky ground, where they did not have much soil, and they sprang up quickly, since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched, and since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Other seeds fell on good soil and brought forth grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. Let anyone with ears listen. Hear then the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what is sown in the heart. This is what was sown on the path. As for what was sown on rocky ground, this is the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy, yet such a person has no root, but endures only for a while. And when the trouble or persecution arises on account of the word, that person immediately falls away. As for what was sown among thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the cares of the world and the lure of wealth choke the word, and it yields nothing. But as for what was sown on good soil, this is the one who hears the word and understands it, who indeed bears fruit and yields, in one case 100-fold, in another 60, and in another 30. This is the gospel of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. So, until a couple of years ago, I was a big-time motorcycle rider. And it was one of my favorite things to do each and every summer, to get on my motorcycle and ride somewhere in the country that I've not been before. It was on one of those rides that I found myself in a 108-degree temperature day, riding down the highway. 108 oppressive, stifling, sweltering degrees, and at 60 miles an hour, it feels like you're riding into a blast furnace. For obvious reasons, there was hardly anybody out and about that day, and you certainly didn't see anybody outside doing any physical labor, except for one farmer. I'd just come over the top of a hill when I noticed him all by himself off in a field to the right side of the highway, maybe about 50 yards away. He was moving sprinkler pipes from one place to the next in that 108-degree heat. Now, I don't know what possessed me to do what I did next, but maybe it was just that I was so impressed by how tenacious this guy was and how industrious and persistent, that this guy was the only guy out working, doing hard physical labor in that kind of heat. But whatever the case, I pulled my motorcycle off to the side of the road. I got off. I started walking across the field. I ended up that afternoon having the most wonderful conversation with this farmer, a man whose name was Lloyd. He had just celebrated his 65th birthday. He was farming the land that his grandfather had farmed many decades earlier, and then his father farmed it, and now it was Lloyd's turn to farm it. Lloyd shared with me that afternoon the history of his land and all of the ups and downs of farming over the years, and the ups and downs the challenges that his family faced. And as he did, I couldn't help but listen in awe, and I felt like I was newly aware of what a special kind of person it takes to be a farmer. So out of that sense of awe, I said, "Lloyd, I got to ask you this question. Of all the qualities it takes to be a farmer, there are so many of them, so many things that it takes to be a good farmer. What quality do you think is the most important?" Now, I thought he would say, "Oh, you got to work hard." Or I thought he would say, "You got to be determined or ambitious or skillful or resourceful or resilient." And there were dozens of other words that maybe I would have expected him to say. But you know what word came to his mind? He said, hopeful. More than anything, he said, I think a farmer has to be hopeful in order to stand any chance of being successful as a farmer. Hopeful when the seasons don't act like the seasons should. Hopeful when prices and markets go up and down and up and down. Hopeful that equipment doesn't break down at exactly the time that it's not supposed to break down. Hopeful about making it through things that you have no control over. All I can say, Lloyd said, is that I go out every day and I do the very best that I know how to do, whether it's raining or whether it's shiny, whether it's hot or cold. And after that, I can only be hopeful. Without hopefulness, he said, I would never make it. I wouldn't survive. I'd go crazy. The Bible story that you just heard is a story about a farmer. Maybe a farmer very much like Lloyd. A farmer went out to sow, Jesus said. It was a subject that everyone knew. Farming happened all around them. It was essential to life. Some of the listeners standing there on the beach probably were even farmers. And maybe even as Jesus told the story, he pointed to a farmer in a distant field, said, look at that guy. In those days, farmers planted seed by broadcasting, which means they walked along and then whoosh, whoosh, they just threw the seed wherever they threw it, every which direction. And it was only after the seed was on the ground that they plowed the seed then into the ground. Well, the problem was that they were never really quite sure what kind of soil they were plowing their seed into. The soil may have looked good when they threw the seed, but oftentimes it was just a thin layer of dirt or dust over limestone or weed roots. But despite that, the farmer would just go and faithfully throw the seed. The farmer knew that a lot of the seed would probably be wasted, but the farmer also knew that some of that seed would produce. And that's what kept them going. Jesus, in his story, acknowledged all the things that caused problems. Oh, rocks and weeds and hungry birds and thorns and all these other things are going to cause problems. And as Jesus told the story, so far it's just kind of a ho-hum story. This is a story, as I said, that people knew well. Farmers knew this story. They knew about all the challenges of farming. It was just a regular story until Jesus said something that shocked them. It was what he said about the yield, the harvest. In those days, a good harvest was sevenfold or eightfold. Tenfold was something that they considered off the charts phenomenal. It just rarely happened. And anything above tenfold was completely ridiculous. It wasn't even considered possible or believable. So knowing that now, listen again to Jesus' words. He says, other seeds fell on good soil and brought forth grain, some 100-fold, some 60, and some 30. And that's when he ended his story with these words, let anyone with ears to hear listen. And if they were listening, what they heard was utterly preposterous. Even the poorest yield in Jesus' story was 3 times higher than what people considered phenomenal and off the charts. But Jesus didn't stop there, not just talking about 30-fold. He said there could be yields of 60-fold and 100-fold. Nobody talked like that. It was crazy talk. What Jesus was suggesting was a whole new reality, a very different view from how things normally work. That's not how the world works. It's not even possible. It's crazy. But you see, that was exactly Jesus' point. It's what made his parable so powerful back then, and it's what makes it especially powerful for us today. To live with that kind of hope and vision, the kind that dares to dream of impossible results, that's what it means to live with the perspective of the kingdom of God. Don't let your mind focus on the rocks and birds and thin soil and whatever else is standing in your way of doing something in life. But rather focus on God's promises. The promise of amazing, even unbelievable things despite the obstacles that might seem so overwhelming. So I want to ask, do you sometimes feel like there are impossible challenges or obstacles in your life. You try so hard to make a difference, to change it, to do something good, only to experience one disappointment after another, one setback after another, one challenge after another. I think what Jesus is saying to you today is, don't give up. Be hopeful. Trust. God will take your abilities and efforts, those seeds that you're sowing, and will do more with them than you can even imagine. One of my favorite church kids ever was a girl named Lindsay, who from the time that she could walk and talk was hopeful that one day she would be a princess. Every day as a child, she tried to look like a princess, act like a princess, talk like a princess, dress like a princess. If you asked her at any point in time as she was growing up, "So Lindsay, what are you going to be when you grow up?" You know what came out of her mouth? "Princess!" And she was as confident about that as she could possibly be. She was constantly making crowns and gowns to wear and building royal castles and carrying around a scepter, and much to the chagrin of her little sister and the family dog, she was constantly ordering and directing them to play their part in her royal court. Her entire childhood was like that. Lindsay never doubted that her job in life was to be a princess. Well, unfortunately, there aren't many jobs for princess in the world. So when Lindsay turned 16, her parents broke the bad news to her. "Lindsay, hate to tell you this, but you're living in the real world now. Time for your Royal Highness to come down from the throne, leave the castle, and go get a job." Lindsay was adamant that she's not going to get a job unless she could find one as a princess. Her parents just laughed and they said, "As far as we're concerned, the last I checked, all the jobs for princess in the whole world are taken. So maybe it's time for you to just kind of lower your standards and go out and do what normal 16-year-olds do. Go get a job." And they kept pestering and pestering and pestering, but Lindsay kept resisting and resisting and resisting until finally, after weeks and weeks of her parents pestering, Lindsay finally gave up some of her aspirations of royalty, and she reluctantly went job hunting. Well, sure enough, guess what happened? One night she came home, her family sat down for dinner, and Lindsay made the great announcement, "I got a job! Hey everybody, I got a job! I start work tomorrow, I'm so excited!" And her parents thought this was great. She finally grew up. "Lindsay, that's wonderful. What's your job?" You want to know what Lindsay said? "Princess." Yeah, right, her family said. They certainly didn't believe her. But in fact, Lindsay had gotten a job at Wild Waves, an enchanted village theme park where her responsibility was to dress up and walk around as Cinderella. She was a princess. Nobody in their wildest imagination thought Lindsay would ever succeed in this cockamamie scheme to be a princess, but she in fact became a princess. And now in her 30s, Princess Lindsay has already worked as a show business executive in Hollywood. I wonder if God doesn't invite us to be dreamers like Lindsay, like Farmer Lloyd, people who refuse to give up hope, even when others are saying, "That's ridiculous." I know how hard it is sometimes. You try to care, you try to make a difference in the world, you try to make things better, you try to meet the challenges that you face in life, but nothing changes. It's as if your words and your efforts fall on rocky soil, or a bunch of big old hungry birds come and snap up your words and before they ever get a chance to make a difference, get a chance to take root. We need to hear Jesus' words and take them to heart. If what he says is true, then by the grace of God, what you sow will bear results. And don't be surprised if those results are beyond belief. Yes, many of the seeds that you plant, many of them, maybe even most of them, will never grow, but your job is not to do the growing. Your job is just to do the planting, the casting. Hungry birds and choking weeds and rocky grounds, those are all going to happen, yes. Seasons won't always act like seasons should, but you Just keep planting. Just keep casting. Be faithful in scattering the seeds of love and compassion and kindness and reason and faith. And be hopeful, trusting that God will take care of the growing in ways that are more than wonderful. So I want to leave you this day with a challenge. Wherever you go in the week ahead, the days ahead, think of yourself as a farmer, going out into the world, out into the community, going out into your family, carrying seeds that literally have the power to change the world. What if you were to do your seed scattering with the persistence and hope of a farmer changing sprinkler pipes in 108-degree heat? Or with the conviction of a child who believes with all of her heart that she's going to be a princess no matter what? Birds and weeds and rocks may make it a challenge, that's for sure, but keep reminding yourself that none of those things, nothing in all creation, can ever be greater than the unbreakable and unshakable promises of God in whatever challenges you face in life. Be hopeful. Trust God. Plant the seeds and trust that God will provide the growth. Amen. Let's stand and join in singing Lord of All Hopefulness.